The time now is 3:05 p.m. We have a quorum, and the meeting has been duly posted. It's been publicly posted. It's a public meeting that's being streamed live. And for anyone that would like to copy the public video and share it, we'd appreciate it so that more people can understand about the work that we're doing publicly. This is a meeting of the Governance Compliance Ad Hoc Committee of the Dallas Independent School District Board of Trustees. We're going to forego the Pledge of Allegiance and the moment of silence, as we will conduct those a little bit later today. I'd like to recognize the ad hoc committee members that are present, Trustee Jaime Resendez, and I am Miguel Solis, the committee chair. Other trustees in attendance are Trustee Dustin Marshall, and our superintendent of schools, Michael Hinojosa, joins us. There has been some feedback. There's been some discussion about the work to date of the Governance Ad Hoc Committee. So I want to make sure that during my chair remarks, I can reiterate the scope of the work. The goal here is, as best as we can, to ensure that we are aligning the practices and procedures of the board towards a set of standards established within a state-created document, the Lone Star Governance tool, which really has served as a rubric for this board now for at least a year, but the beginnings of the document actually for multiple years, to ensure that we are continuing to increase our effectiveness as a board towards a set of shared goals that were established years ago now in collaboration with the superintendent of schools. These are public meetings. They're open to the public. We meet once a month. Those meetings are posted well in advance of the meetings, and we hope that you'll join us in continuing to work towards excellence as both a board and an administration. We're now going to move on to agenda item 4.1, which will be a discussion of an update on board onboarding, training, and continuing education development. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Trustee Resendez, who has been working on this particular tranche of work.
Sure.
Trustee Resendez?
Thank you, Trustee Solis. So I just want to just provide a quick update on the work I've been doing. I've been able to review BBD Legal, BBD Exhibit, BDAA Local, BBD Local, as well as some of the information from the Texas Association of School Boards. And the policy fellow that I'm working with, we plan on having more meetings, obviously, to try to iron some of these things out. I already have a few things that I think we can try to focus on. That includes that it's focused on the new board member orientation. But we're just going to continue to meet, continue to work on it, and hopefully have something for the committee to consider, and meet with the administration and other board members too, to ensure that it works for everybody.
Thank you, Trustee Resendez. And as a reminder on the different buckets of work, at this point, after this meeting, we will have completely defined the full scope of what we intend on focusing on. And then each meeting moving forward, we will have discussions with our fellows that are helping the trustees and also the administration on any proposed amendments or additions that we would like to see in each of the three areas of focus. So a lot of this has been us beginning to understand what we want to talk about and how we might want to make changes, and every meeting moving forward would be what those changes may look like based on the general topics that we've been discussing: onboarding, continued professional development, aligning our board operating procedures to Lone Star governance as best we can, and then scrutinizing particular board policies to ensure they're in alignment with board operating procedure with Lone Star governance. Next, we're going to move on to agenda item. Actually, before I move forward, is there Superintendent Hinojosa, anything you want to add? All right, we'll move on now to item 4.2, which is an update on board operating procedures revisions. We are going to hear from the Leadership ISD Policy Fellow, Mr. Joe Carrion, who has been working on this in collaboration with Trustee Henry. Mr. Carrion, the floor is yours. You'll need to hit that voice. There you go.
Okay. Thank you, Trustee Solis. My name is Joe Carrion. I've been working with Trustee Henry in an attempt to integrate the Lone Star governance framework specifically into the board operating procedures. The update is brief. Trustee Henry and I have communicated multiple times. What we've done over the last, or since we last met, was really dive into the Lone Star governance framework, each of the 5 sections: vision, accountability, advocacy, structure, etc., and then attempted to comment on the current board operating procedures, if we were to make changes, where those changes would occur. So we haven't begun the work of actually redlining a document or revising any language or even contemplating, just if we were to kind of insert or integrate some of the Lone Star governance goals into our current board operating procedures, where would it fit within the current board operating procedures? Where would it make kind of sense so it remains a kind of readable, digestible document?
I'm wondering if there may be highlights that you can kind of give us about the things that you've noticed as it relates to what the current board operating procedures state and how they may or may not speak to the different elements of Lone Star governance.
Yes, Trustee. So there's I believe, much opportunity to really integrate the framework into the board operating procedures. Just on like the section on vision, for example, being more explicit on including families and community members in the development of the board's vision and goals, having that language really explicitly in the board operating procedures is something that Trustee Henry and I have touched upon on every issue. On unity, the board operating procedures contains a section that's specifically on what board members shall do and how they should conduct themselves. So agreeing, for example, that all board members shall agree that it is the responsibility that they are responsible for the outcomes of all students, not just the students of their particular district. That is a component of the Lone Star governance framework that isn't explicitly stated in the board operating procedures, but again, it can be included. So on every subject, on every section, whether it's vision, unity, structure, being more, again, clear about how many primary topics should be made for discussion at each board meeting and briefing. The Lone Star governance touches on those topics. We believe there's space within the board of operating procedures to kind of include that language and be a little clearer. Again, exact language we have to work through, but we're really just looking at what the master's focus is and MEET's focus, master's focus are for the Lone Star governance framework, and seeing where we could potentially include some of these items. So we think there's some room for doing that.
That's great. Trustees, any other questions about this particular update? Dr. Hinojosa? No? Okay. Great. Thanks, Joe. We appreciate it, and we're looking forward to the continued work together. Okay, now we're going to move on to item 4.3, which is the discussion of the Lone Star Governance Tool. I have provided the Lone Star Governance framework again to each of you at this table. And Justin, you don't have it, but because Justin's not here at the moment, I'm going to go ahead and pass all this over to you so you can see it. You'll see it's not the entire framework. There are actually only 2 components here. And the reason why I wanted to highlight these 2 components is because through my review of the current board policies, separate and aside from any policies that we would have already touched on, given the stuff that we've talked about with Trustee Resendez's work and Trustee Henry's work, I think these particular components speak directly to board policies that we have not addressed. And it really, to get straight to the point, the thing that I would hope that we would focus on with board policy might be how we utilize the time that we spend with each other and with the administration together, how we utilize that to ensure that we are maximizing our efficiency and maximizing our effectiveness related to student outcomes. So if you'll look at this first, I guess it would be page 40, which is the side that says Texas Framework Accountability, Accountability 1, the board invests at least half of its time focusing on its vision and student outcome goals. There are a couple items here specifically related to our board-authorized public meetings. I'm going to ask you to just take a second to read through the entire, from does not meet focus all the way to master's focus, and see if you can identify some of the things that I might be speaking about related to board-authorized public meetings. And then Pam, not to put you on the spot, but to put you on the spot, would you mind just coming up real quick, because I'm going to have probably a couple questions to you. So I guess to start this, Pam, I would ask you, and if you don't have the answer to this, it's totally okay. When it comes to Accountability 1 and our current scores, do you have the current score? Yeah, absolutely. So question 1, I think, would be, what is our score? And then question number 2 would be a little more nuanced and related specifically to the amount of time that we spend focused on in board meetings.
Trustee Solis, I'm not seeing it here, but I know our scores. Accountability 1, we are at 0 on Accountability 1. We have certain aspects in each of the columns, but in order to have the full points, you have to have each one of the areas completed.
So I guess then the follow-up question would be, we can be at a 0 and still maybe not even accomplish what it says we need to do in 0.
Correct.
So when it says the board does not track its use of time in board-authorized public meetings, we don't do we not have a tracker that does that?
So Dino does track the minutes. However, tracking them towards student outcome goals, we haven't done that.
Got it.
So, I mean, I guess it all depends on how you interpret it, and compliance, I guess I could highlight that, but I think it really should be probably toward student outcome goals.
I'm also wondering if we are tracking that, and I know this it's probably a Dino question, but if we are tracking that, does the board see that information, or do we have access to that information? No? It's okay. Dr. Munoz.
One of the reasons that we're not really bringing it forward is that we're nowhere near 50%, or we're nowhere near 25%. So I'm sure that if we had to go back and analyze the previous meetings, if we were close, then it would be meaningful. But Dino has that information, but we're not anywhere close to the standard. So
Got it.
we probably need to get that ramped up if you think that this committee's work's actually going to produce some meaningful outcomes.
Okay. Great. So if you all will then look at the board policies that I provided as well. We're going to discuss these board policies, but I want you, as we're looking at this Lone Star governance tool, to know that it's my belief, and I'm proposing this for the first time, so it may not be your belief, but I'd ask that you take a look at these things, that these are the policies, BE, BDB, BED, and BF that speak either directly or indirectly to accountability one and our best shot at getting to master's focus. Master's focus and accountability ones is really specific. It says of the total monthly minutes spent in board authorized public meetings, no fewer than 50% are invested in progress monitoring the board's student outcome goals or setting student outcome goals and GPMs. I tend to agree with you, Dr. Hinojosa, that it's probably not the case that 50% of our time is focused on those specific goals. But I'm also of the belief that there may be able to be a way to better align the time that we use doing this work towards that. But if you flip the other side, then you'll look at structure. The board delegates to the superintendent operational authority to accomplish the vision and student outcome goals. Go ahead and take just maybe 30 seconds to read through, or give yourself a minute to read through from does not meet focus to master's focus, primarily focusing on the structure of meetings.
Do you have extra copies of the materials that you passed out?
Yes, I don't right now, but as soon as I'm done, I'll give you everything that I've got.
Okay, because she doesn't have any either.
Oh, Pam doesn't have any.
No, so you only make copies, give it to me.
She should.
Need it right now.
I think she'll be fine. We'll be fine, yeah. Okay, so Pam, where are we at on structure?
Or it does not meet focus.
Does not meet focus. I guess, so how many meetings do we typically have, public board authorized meetings, in a month, generally speaking?
Typically, we have two regular meetings, the briefing and the night meeting, but we also have hearings and other things that may or may not be exempt. But audit committee meetings, et cetera, but the full board is typically two. There may be some others sporadically scheduled.
I think one of the things we may want to get clarity around as we continue to figure out how do we actually interpret Lone Star governance would be what constitutes a board-authorized public meeting and what doesn't in the eyes of TEA. Because as Dr. Hinojosa already said, I mean, there are certain times where we may have to have an emergency meeting or we have to have an additional meeting on top of the board meeting. If you're going to, let's say, we get reports from the state that we have to have a discussion about in public, or we have to, the taper, things like that we have to discuss. Right. I wonder if there's a way that we might be able to get clarity around that. But then the other thing is any meeting of the board lasted more than 8 hours. I mean, I remember being in a long meetings. I will say that I feel like we've improved a little bit. Staff may not completely agree with that.
We don't.
But do
No,
we
you have improved. You have improved.
I guess, Dino, do we have a general sense of like what, how long we spend in meetings? Do we track, and we're tracking the timing of all that as well? Every meeting. Do you have a general? So we are below the 8-hour threshold. Okay, well, that's good to know.
Is that on an average, or is that, what does this mean? This is any, to me, that says any meeting of the board lasted more than 8 hours.
Right.
So I know we've had at least one meeting in the last quarter that lasted more than 8 hours.
And this also begs the question, with this particular framework, if you get out a zero, like zero says, it's pretty definitive that any meeting of the board that lasts more than 8 hours puts you back at 0. So if we meet every other thing that we would need to meet to get to master's focus, and one time we have a meeting that goes more than 8 hours, are we then all the way back to 0 and then have to work our way back up? Or like, what? How does that work in the eyes of the state?
I mean, and of course, we can talk to TEA to get more clarification, but the way I see it and the way that I've been, it's been discussed is you have to have completed everything in the column before you can advance to the next to receive those points.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and that's similar, Joe was talking about, in order to get to masters, you have to include families and community for developing goals. And so we have goals, but I don't think that we have, gone out to the community to develop them. We've certainly talked to DAC. So it means that we stay in the meets focus area because we didn't have more, I would say, an intentionality on the front end of bringing community in to get to the masters.
Got you.
So,
Do y'all have any questions related to this? Or?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions and concerns, to be quite frank. One of my concerns is what people's perceptions of the work that we're doing now, especially related to what we're discussing at this time. Because student outcome goals, to me, is our primary purpose, but we're also tasked with being stewards of taxpayer dollars, right? And if I have questions about something that's not specifically related to student outcome goals, how can you tell me to stop asking questions, I think there's obviously has to be some type of balance because a lot of people are concerned about transparency. So that's one of my concerns.
Yep. Trustee Marshall, anything? So basically, I think, when we think about the elements of Lone Star governance that require, that are specifically focused on the time that we spend together and the structure in which we spend that time, I think it's probably important that at the very least we begin to scrutinize the things that may or may not allow us the opportunity to be able to get to that point where we would be at Master's Focus. And really in structure for Master's Focus, it says that you should have no more than 3 board-authorized public meetings per month and none last more than 2 hours. That the board schedules no more than 3 primary topics for discussion during any board-authorized public meeting. And then later on, receive the final version of materials per a specific amount of days, 7 calendar days. No edits are made to the board's regularly scheduled meeting agenda during the meeting. I think the work of the policy section would be more hypothetical, and it would be casting a vision of how could we accomplish both what they may be suggesting is the most effective way to utilize your time in board meetings related to improving student achievement,
He borrowed it.
but at the same time, make sure that we are meeting our financial responsibilities and our fiduciary responsibilities, exactly going to what Trustee Resendez just said. Now, let's then now move on to item 4.4 on the agenda, which is the discussion of board policies. So I've already laid out for you the board policies that I think are most directly related to the components of structure and the components of accountability that I just laid out for you. Those are, again, board policies BE, BDB, BED, and BF. And the first thing that I would sort of pose as a discussion point to the committee would be the use of committees themselves. There's a little bit of history, at least during my time on the board, related to the structuring of committees. It used to be a while back that we had a lot more committees. And actually, not to put you on the spot, Dr. Hinojosa, but to put you on the spot, can you talk to us about, during your experience as a superintendent, how you have seen board committees used? And if you would actually go a step further to see maybe how you've seen them used effectively and then maybe ineffectively.
Good question, and to be succinct, there are certain committees that do the work of the board in a specialized technical way, and some of them are standing committees, but some of them are ad hoc committees. An example of a standing committee is the audit committee. And 3 members get a chance to review the information. They provide feedback to the auditor and to the administration about what needs to be handled, and those meetings can be very efficient and productive. I've seen other meetings that turned into mini board meetings where, for example, and I've experienced these, you had a personnel committee where then the board wanted to know all aspects of staffing, et cetera, and then they'd meet for hours, and then a lot of the other board members who weren't on the committee were wondering, what was discussed and what happened at that. Or you may have an instructional committee to talk about, achievement gaps, et cetera. And in those meetings, and sometimes if they're a standing committee, then people are looking for things to put on the agenda. Now, there could be a very specific ad hoc committee that needs to be put together, like we have one of those. This is the superintendent's evaluation. And that committee has a very specific purpose. Once they finish that purpose, that committee expires. But what I've seen unproductive are just general meetings of topics that are a finance committee, where you just meet infinitum about financial issues. And a lot of times those are reactions to certain things that have happened in school districts that now the board feels responsible for some oversight. But then it also gives the opportunity to get into the weeds on certain topics that may or may not be productive. So that kind of runs the gamut of a standing committee, a specific purpose ad hoc committee, and then just some general committees that go on, depending on the original intent may have been innocuous, but then it took a life of its own. And then all of those count towards the time that the board spends in meetings.
Right now, the way we structure our meetings, we have a board briefing where we discuss a ton of topics, some related to student outcomes, others related to the business of the district. And then we have a board meeting where we basically do the exact same thing again, depending on, a certain amount of trustees wanting to have those discussions. But we also have, as Dr. Hinojosa already mentioned, one committee that is in policy that does another function, and that's the audit committee. Trustee Marshall, seeing as you're the chair of the audit committee, can you just talk to us a little bit about what the structure of your meetings look like, and give us sort of like how long they last, what you talk about, and then how you ultimately inform the board about the work that you all do?
Sure. I mean, it's a 3-member committee that I chair with trustees Flores and Foreman. We meet 4 times a year, ranges from an hour to 2 hours generally. We get readouts from the external auditors and also review the status of this year's audit plan, go through any finalized audits, and then have a tracking system to go back and ensure the administration has complied with the recommendations of previous audits. And then, whatever findings are germane, we share them at the board meetings with the full board.
And the reason why we have an audit committee is because there are 2 employees that specifically report to the board, superintendent and the chief internal auditor.
That's right.
And so we need to make sure that we are scrutinizing the work of the auditor and the work of the audit department as well.
Exactly.
Those meetings are public, correct?
Yep.
And during your time as chair, or maybe even serving on the audit committee, and Trustee Resendez, if I'm not mistaken, you've been chair as well. Did any other board members attend?
I've never had a trustee that was not on the committee attend one of my meetings.
What about you, Trustee Resendez?
Once I remember at the beginning when I first started serving, I believe a trustee showed up to a meeting or 2. That a trustee that was not on that committee.
Yeah. And sort of similar to the committee that we're doing right now, which is, again, an ad hoc committee. It's not a standing committee, but people can come to these meetings if they want. They're public meetings. Trustees can come in. Trustees can talk about the topics at these meetings. Do y'all take votes in the committee?
Yes.
And the vote, and whatever you vote on ultimately is recommended to the full board for a final vote?
Well, the audit committee is unique in that it has certain powers delegated to it that we can vote on things. Certain things don't need to come to the full board if they're voted and passed in the audit committee, but most of the things we pass in the audit committee are just passing the recommendation to the full board.
So technically right now, if we put aside all of the other meetings that can pop up, there are 3 board meetings that are publicly authorized board meetings. The audit committee meeting and our briefing and our monthly meeting. I think it'd also be interesting to know from the TEA their thoughts on what committees may or not be relevant committees in their eyes related to the work of the district and maybe even student outcome goals as well. Meaning, is it okay for us to have more committees? And if there are, what type of committees should we be establishing and what maybe should we not? Or what would their suggestions be around that? And the reason I bring this up is to say that there may be ways that we get to Master's Focus that involve us breaking up some of the work that we do as a board. If we talk about everything at the board briefing, and then we basically talk about the same stuff at the board meeting, I think a question we need to ask ourselves as a committee, and ultimately as a full board, is why do we do it that way? All this in board policy, if we wanted to change it, we could change it. There's nothing legally that suggests that we have to do board meetings a particular type of way. Is that correct?
I believe so.
Dr. Hinojosa?
That's definitely accurate. The board has total purview. Some districts don't even have a briefing, and some have a work session right before the voting meeting or the same day. So yes, there's total flexibility for individual boards to structure their meetings the way they desire.
All right, so now I'm going to put you on the spot, Dr. Hinojosa, okay? And I want you to be very transparent as you can be. If you could create, and again, I recognize you're the superintendent, you're not elected, you don't have constituents, but you run this district. If you could create a more effective approach to the structuring of board meetings, how might you go about that? And I would say, think about 1 month, how might we more effectively approach our work?
Yes, thank you. I have reservations about committees because in my contract, I'm required to be at, or my designee at every meeting of the board. So I would have to make sure that we have staff assigned to any and all meetings. So, but there is a legitimate purpose for having, in a district this size with the number of agenda items that the board has to consider, there is a legitimate process for a pre-meeting. Now, how that is structured ideally is that if you want to have a meeting early in the month so that trustees can ask the questions that are appropriate and then the staff has time to respond to them, and then at your voting meeting, then not to rehash everything, but anything that wasn't resolved, then that's a good way to have a process that would be clean, effective, allow the board to oversee the management. But in reality, many times certain topics get repeated and questions are asked again, and so the structure that we have is not inherently bad. It's just is it executed? But I do think it is unreasonable in a district this size with this kind of budget and these number of employees and this many policies that there only be 1 meeting a month. But how you have the pre-meeting can be structured many different ways. In fact, sometimes I've had it where it was the week before and then the voting. I've even had it where in one district we had the pre-meeting on a Monday and we had to get the responses by Thursday night for a vote. And then if it wasn't ready, then it was deferred for a month. So, and that required administration much less time in preparing for a board meeting. So there is no one best way, but for me, what would be ideal, to answer your question succinctly, is if we truly had the process where we present the information and then whatever's unresolved, we get that information back so that the board can make their vote. And so that would be the ideal for me, and that could be accomplished many different ways.
And so the follow-up question to that would be, given your experience as a superintendent, and this can be both at the helm of the district or in consulting with other districts across the United States, is there any district that you believe has most effectively utilized its time and energies in the structuring of board meetings?
There are some districts, and I'll have to go back and research it a little bit more as to find out who's done it. I've seen some districts who do it worse. One district, a large district in Texas, they have a board meeting every Monday, and that would not something I would recommend. There are some districts that have done different things. They use the consent agenda very well, and they have some tight parameters. By being a superintendent for 24 years, I'm always, I've been to very few other board meetings except when I was doing some consulting or superintendent searches. So I really would have to do a little bit of research. But I know there are some that execute good governance and find a way to meet the needs that the board has to have, but yet are efficient with their time. But I'll have to go back and talk to some of my colleagues and see who are some of the higher functioning boards. I don't know that I could give you one off the top of my head today.
So the next question that I've got actually is and I'm going to I'm putting everybody on the spot, by the way, today. Trustee Henry, as a new board member, having, I'm sure, either served on other boards separate and aside from DISD, or participated in board meetings through work, what are your initial thoughts, I think, on how we might be able to more effectively use our time as a board, specifically focus on the structuring of meetings? Do you have any ideas on ways that we might be able to change our work or more effectively structure our work?
Yeah, put me on the spot. I do think there's ways, but again, it's just my opinion. It's anecdotal. I've only been on the board since June, so I'm not saying that there's any way to prove that it would make it more efficient. But I think, being strategic around what's on the consent agenda and what's not, making sure that we are very efficient in how we use the time between our board briefings and our board meetings to get as many questions answered as possible and to ensure that the administration is being as responsive as possible, so we're not waiting until the day of the meeting. When you look at the agenda, I've always, I'm new, so I'm going to throw this out there. I've always wondered why we have them grouped the way we have them grouped, as opposed to maybe around, strategic initiatives from the district, or there's other ways I think you could group an agenda. So I have thoughts. I don't think any of them are, data-driven or research-supported. But those are some things that I've noticed, questions that I've had being on the board since June.
Trustee Resendez, do you have any thoughts?
I had some similar thoughts, especially utilizing our time between meetings, well, not just us utilizing our time as trustees, but making sure the administration provides the information that we need so that we won't have to ask all these questions during the meetings.
Trustee Marshall, any thoughts?
I think that questions that have been submitted to the administration prior to the meeting and answered in a timely fashion should, unless there's further information required, should not be the focus of reiterating the same discussion that happens at the briefing and then again at the board meeting, in some cases, just to have that stated on the record, in front of the media, on camera. So, any policies or practices that can ensure the flow of information is timely and smooth and happens prior to the board meeting, I think would save a lot of time and make the meetings run more efficiently and allow us to focus on discussions that really matter, that impact kids.
I think if you go back and it may be in board policy, but it also, I could have seen this in board operating procedures. There was a time, and Dino, you might be able to help me remember this more clearly, but there was a time where we were directing the board in meetings, at the end of meetings, to make sure that we had very clear, specific requests that could be issued to the administration. So that, and I guess this would have been at board briefings. So that way, by the time that we get to the board meeting, administration had more than enough time to try to identify all of the things, to answer all of the questions. Like there literally is somewhere, whether it's in policy or board operating procedures, and Joe, you might come across this, where it says, at the end of every meeting, I think it's maybe the board president will say, here are what all of the trustees have asked for in order to make an informed decision in 2 or 3 weeks. If that is the case, that may be yet again another example of ways that we might be able to make sure we just do what we said we were going to do. Because what I feel like happens is that you all, as best as you can, try to record as much of what we say in board briefings. And if I'm not mistaken, one of y'all over there has to sit down and just rewatch the whole meeting again, and there's a special place in heaven for you, Kay. And then you try as best as you can to capture all that information, which I then assume goes to Dino or someone that puts it on the trackers, goes to the chiefs. You all figure out ways to try to make sure that you even understood the questions to begin with. Then you try to identify all that information and then get it back to the board a specific amount of days before. Is that right? To me, that doesn't seem like the most efficient way, and it has nothing to do with any of you or us, perhaps just the systems that we've set up or the structures we've set up within meetings to actually allow y'all a fair chance to get the information answered and back to trustees. Dr. Hinojosa?
In addition to that, a lot of times while our staff gets together, Dino sends us, these are the notes from the briefing. There is no measure of quality in there. It's just volume of questions and requests. And if they don't have anything to do with student achievement, then you're never going to accomplish your student achievement goals.
Yep.
And so it's just a list of everything that the board members want us to go hunt down before we vote. But there's no measure of quality or outcome on those lists of things that we have to then generate a response for. So then that self-perpetuates. So if it has nothing to do with student outcomes, then when it goes to a further discussion at the night meeting, well, we lose points because we lose time because it's not related to student outcomes.
That's a really good point. Okay, so the discussion here is simply to say that I think that there are ways, and I think we probably all agree that there are ways that we could more effectively and efficiently utilize our time together in publicly authorized meetings to make sure that we are focusing really on what I think we all agree we need to be focusing on, which is student outcomes, but at the same time ensuring that we can meet our fiduciary responsibilities, going back to something that Trustee Resendez said. So the work of this policy working, I guess it's subcommittee or group, will be to do is to, as best as we can, align our board policies around getting the master's focus in the accountability and the structure piece. At the same time, any work that's being done by the board operating procedures group or the training group that need to be reflected in board policy will also be the responsibility of myself and my fellow as well. But I can tell you this, moving forward with all of our meetings, as I stated at the beginning, it will be a very different looking meeting. It will be heavily focused on ideas coming to the table, on specific changes that we want to discuss, debate, throw out there, so that we ultimately can begin working towards a comprehensive package of suggested amendments to each of the three work scopes that the full board can then consider and hopefully by June take action on one way or the other. And so with that, I think that if anybody has any other questions at this point about what is expected from each of the committee members or what the administration may expect or request from the committee as we continue to do our work, if there are no questions about that, then I think we will call this meeting to a close. Okay, actually, when is the next meeting? Do we have the date on that and the time? Because I know we've got a whole bunch of vacation coming up. December? That's what I see in December. Okay. Do you have the 17th as well, Pam? Okay. All right, so our next meeting will be December 17th at 3 o'clock, and all committees should be prepared to come to the table with the beginnings of ideas for discussion and debate. Appreciate all your time and all the work that you've spent getting us to this point. The time now is 3:49 p.m., and this meeting is adjourned.